Welcome to the debate. Today we're analyzing the strategic challenges facing U.S. foreign policy and trade. The fundamental landscape, well, it's defined by the necessity of deterring powers like China and Russia, the urgent imperative to secure critical supply chains, and crucially, sort of redefining the rules of engagement within our alliances.
It is absolutely a pivotal moment. Every decision we make about trade or defense today really sets the course for global stability for the next decade, doesn't it? The central tension, as I see it, is how we lead, whether we rely primarily on unilateral power, perhaps, or on synchronized collective strength.
Precisely. Okay, so that brings us to our central question. Is U.S. security and economic resilience best achieved by prioritizing, hard-nosed trade leverage, maintaining clear military overmatch, and demanding strict, measurable allied burden sharing? That's the position I'll be exploring.
Or is the better path found in strengthening multilateral frameworks, integrating a robust domestic industrial policy, and advancing a durable rules-based order through, let's say, strategic statecraft that prioritizes standards and values? And I'll be arguing from that perspective, focusing on multiplying American power through coordination, not necessarily coercion.
Right. I see why you'd frame it that way. But let me give you a different perspective. My core thesis is, that the U.S. must first and foremost protect its security, its prosperity, and its sovereignty. This means we simply cannot afford to outsource either our defense readiness or the supply of critical technologies to partners who may free ride or, whose political will might falter, let alone to known adversaries. So, to achieve this, we need unambiguous deterrence. That means accelerating our military overmatch, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and surging readiness. We must immediately rebuild our munitions production and shipbuilding capacity. Now, when it comes to alliances, we strengthen them by requiring concrete, measurable contributions. The 2% of GDP defense spending floor for NATO and Indo-Pacific partners, it must be enforced. And we've already seen some success, I think, in raising allied outlays through this kind of firm pressure.
That's a compelling point regarding sovereignty, though I would frame the economic necessity perhaps a bit differently.
Economically, we must practice what I call bordered globalization. This is strategic and targeted. It means using tariffs, like those on steel and aluminum, anti-dumping measures, and strong Buy American provisions, not as, simple protectionism, but as essential bargaining chips and as immediate defenses for key domestic industries threatened by state-subsidized competition. Finally, resilience must focus on onshoring strategic supply chains, chips, batteries, pharma, via active controls like CHS export restrictions and a rigorous outbound investment screening, which limits capital flowing into sensitive adversarial technologies like advanced AI or quantum computing.
My core thesis is that we maximize our global influence by leveraging alliances and employing highly targeted economic statecraft, all underpinned by, sustained smart domestic investment, which allows us to set the global standard, not retreat from it. So to that end, we must strengthen existing coalitions, NATO, and our Indo-Pacific partners, to multiply our power through coordinated action. Look at the real-world success of coordinated sanctions and export controls against aggressors. They are far more debilitating generally than any unilateral move. Economically, our strategy must be invest to compete. This means robust industrial policy for critical sectors like chips and clean energy, coupled with a deep reliance on friendshoring, which strategically relocates production to allied or trusted partners. This reduces reliance on adversaries without retreating into, frankly, the crushing cost of autarky.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because relying on coordination still risks, the dilution of effort and potentially unacceptable delays when speed is paramount.
Our trade policy must pivot away from focusing solely on mere market access and focus instead on enforcing enforceable labor and environmental standards. Using standards-based trade avoids a disastrous race to the bottom that hollows out our own manufacturing base. Finally, when managing China, the approach must be one of intense competition, not collision. We must establish guardrails, hotlines, crisis communication protocols to prevent accidents while holding absolutely firm on human rights and intellectual property theft.
Okay. Let's focus immediately on the tools we use to achieve economic security, because that is where I think the divide is clearest. You champion standards, but I assert that tariffs and anti-dumping measures are necessary for immediate cost imposition on adversaries and serve as critical leverage in trade negotiations. We have evidence. When tariffs were imposed on steel and aluminum, they forced reluctant partners to the table to negotiate trade limits and common security measures. Relying solely on standards is just too slow, often taking years of multilateral negotiation to implement enforceable mechanisms. Frankly, we need rapid, targeted action right now to protect our critical supply resilience, not some protracted multilateral conference.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that tariffs are the superior tool for long-term resilience. Let me tell you why. Tariffs are taxes, essentially, on U.S. consumers and industries that rely on imports. They risk alienating the very allies, Japan, the EU, South Korea, that you need to form a united front against Beijing, inviting immediate and, frankly, predictable retaliation that hurts our own exporters. While tariffs impose costs, they often impose those costs significantly on us. It seems to me the superior economic approach is leveraging multilateral forums to implement enforceable labor and environment standards and actively seek what I call tariff-for-standard swaps. We can lower broad protectionist tariffs in exchange for partner nations accepting robust, enforceable standards, meaning transparency, verifiable supply chain auditing, and snapback mechanisms if they cheat. This provides a massive incentive for the partner and avoids bloating U.S. industrial policy. A concrete example of a robust standard could be something like a cross-border carbon adjustment mechanism, a way to enforce global climate responsibility through trade policy, which your approach, focused purely on leverage, kind of ignores.
Well, that sounds great in theory, creating a perfect multilateral incentive structure. But what mechanism do we have for rapid cost imposition on Beijing today, before those standards deals are ratified years down the line? I mean, if China attempts to dump highly subsidized goods, how does a negotiated standard prevent the immediate collapse of a critical U.S. industry? We need immediate leverage. Furthermore, the reliance on these swaps means that if a partner refuses to adopt the standard, aren't we just left back where we started? They gain market access without meeting our requirements, and we've lost our bargaining chip.
But our rapid cost imposition comes through targeted export controls and coordinated sanctions, not broad tariffs. We impose costs where they really hurt, on advanced technologies like semiconductors, through a united front that's far more surgical than a blanket tariff. We're not talking about universal free trade here. We are talking about using our domestic market as an incentive for better behavior, enforced by transparency. Standards-based trade, I believe, is the only way to achieve long-term, non-protectionist resilience and transparency without resorting to those non-tariff barriers that just confuse global trade.
Okay, that leads us directly to the debate over physical supply chain resilience, which, your standards-based approach still leaves somewhat vulnerable, in my view. If our goal is true security, we must prioritize onshoring key strategic nodes, advanced chips, specialized batteries, critical pharmaceutical intermediates. Citing the vulnerability that comes from outsourcing, for instance, Taiwan's extreme dominance in certain semiconductor nodes, is essential. Defense readiness demands securing the full supply chain either fully at home or within immediate operational control. So, doesn't friendshoring still mean reliance on partners who might, free ride on U.S. security guarantees, or whose coalitions are inherently vulnerable because they move slowly or fracture, as the material suggests, during times of crisis? I'm just trying to figure out why we would take that risk when sovereignty demands secure domestic production of inputs essential for our military and economy.
That is a compelling argument, I grant you. But have you considered the economic cost and, frankly, the strategic inflexibility of mandatory large-scale onshoring? Attempting autarky, which is what large-scale onshoring of everything kind of amounts to, is not only economically crippling due to high labor, land, and energy cost differentials compared to our allied nations, but it's also strategically foolish. It concentrates risk. I mean, if a natural disaster or some domestic political upheaval hits our sole domestic plant, we are paralyzed. Industrial policy coupled with friendshoring is actually more durable and far more cost-effective, I'd argue. We should advocate for allied supply chain compacts, These would be formal agreements with joint capacity targets for chips, batteries, and critical minerals, with mutual recognition and shared stockpiles. This achieves redundancy, reduces reliance on any single node, and importantly, reinforces our alliances.
We call this targeted de-risking, not decoupling. We are reducing specific vulnerabilities without sacrificing the vast economic benefits of global engagement. And while I acknowledge the risk that industrial policy might pick winners, domestic investment in R&D and manufacturing capacity sustains the high-tech competitiveness required for us to lead the very compacts we need abroad.
I agree that allied compacts sound efficient, but who is responsible when a, let's say, free-riding partner fails to meet their capacity targets? If the U.S. is the ultimate guarantor of global security, doesn't it follow that the U.S. must maintain the ultimate capacity to manufacture its own warfighting materials? Relying on a complex web of mutual agreements that requires constant political negotiation just seems slower than investing aggressively in domestic sovereign capacity today.
But your approach seems to assume we have unlimited capital to onshore all necessary production. We don't. We have to prioritize. When we invest in these domestic capacities, and we must, that part is non-negotiable. It strengthens our hand to negotiate these compacts and ensure compliance. Furthermore, those partners have the incentive of access to the U.S. market and U.S. technology. That economic leverage helps ensure compliance without us having to swallow the entire cost of global resilience ourselves.
Okay, this discussion of allies meeting their commitments naturally brings us to the critical issue of burden sharing and alliance management. I assert that requiring the 2% plus defense spending is non-negotiable for NATO and our Indo-Pacific partners. It's not just about the money, it ensures concrete contributions, demonstrates seriousness to our adversaries, and fundamentally prevents allies from free-riding off the U.S. security umbrella. Furthermore, the critique that this represents an overemphasis on military tools is, I think, misplaced. The greatest danger is strategic ambiguity. A clear, demonstrated commitment to military overmatch and surge readiness, backed by our allies' financial commitments, is necessary to ensure clear deterrence, which history generally shows is the key to preventing major conflicts by discouraging miscalculation by adversaries.
I agree that deterrence is paramount, absolutely. But the singular focus on the 2% metric and this militarized framing risks crowding out diplomacy and economic statecraft, and that is a serious political and strategic vulnerability in your approach, I think. We risk alienating strategically vital partners like South Korea or Germany precisely when we need their cooperation on sanctions or export controls the most. Multilateralism ensures that complex tools like coordinated sanctions and export controls, particularly those targeting advanced semi-controls, multiply their effectiveness and truly isolate adversaries. When the U.S. acts unilaterally, the adversary often has many avenues of commerce and political engagement remaining. When we coordinate with the G7 and our Indo-Pacific partners, they are truly cut off. We need a smart military posture that sustains precise aid and equipment to partners such as Ukraine and Taiwan, allowing them to defend themselves, with rigorous oversight, of course, while avoiding the massive costs and strategic drain of large-scale, forward-deployed U.S. occupations or garrisons. Effective statecraft relies on multiplying diplomatic and economic power just as much as military might.
I understand the desire for a smart posture, but military capacity is the foundation upon which all diplomatic leverage is built. If our adversaries do not believe we possess the willingness and the ready capacity to intervene and win, no amount of coordinated export controls will deter aggression. The 2% plus formula isn't just some diplomatic inconvenience. It is a clear measure of collective political will that must be demonstrated to the adversary. If our allies won't commit to that baseline funding, how can we trust them in a supply chain compact during a shooting war?
That's a fair question regarding trust, but you're perhaps conflating defense spending with strategic alignment. Many allies contribute heavily in other ways: soft power, intelligence, economic cohesion, which are also necessary inputs for deterrence. Forcing a rigid 2% metric risks pushing allies to spend money inefficiently or, resentfully, rather than focusing on the specific capabilities, cyber, maritime security, logistics, that genuinely complement U.S. forces. We must prioritize coordinated capabilities over somewhat arbitrary spending floors.
Look, we both share the goal of enduring stability and superior readiness, but we differ fundamentally on the primary source of that stability. Is it clear leverage backed by military overmatch, or is it coordination and consensus?
That's correct. We're debating the strategy and the optimal levers, not really the desired end state.
So, to reiterate my position, security and prosperity demand credible deterrence and hard leverage. Sovereignty requires clear, non-negotiable lines on technology, enforced through powerful tools like export controls and investment screening, and demanding measurable contributions from allies via the 2% plus formula. The focus must remain on imposing clearer costs on adversaries rapidly and effectively. That is the quickest path, I believe, to genuine sovereign resilience.
And my position remains that global leadership relies on coordinated power and setting standards, not unilateral pressure and broad tariffs. Integrating strong domestic investment through the invest-to-compete model, meticulously orchestrating alliance compacts, and leveraging values-driven standards ensures a far more durable and resilient path forward. Multilateralism, I maintain, is the path to long-term stability and maintaining open markets for U.S. firms, which fundamentally underpins our prosperity and our global influence.
It is important to note, though, that both of our approaches share the ultimate goals: improved deterrence and readiness, exemplified by metrics like, say, munitions delivery rates, and enhanced supply chain resilience, measured perhaps by things like dual sourcing rates for critical inputs.
Exactly. This debate really centers on the most effective strategy to achieve those shared benchmarks, and the source material does suggest significant overlap in realistic solutions. We both seem to endorse targeted de-risking and the concept of allied supply chain compacts, demonstrating that considering both hard leverage and coordinated statecraft is essential for navigating these complex modern challenges.